I'm Bob Doyle, the information philosopher, webcasting from my ITV studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm hoping to reach philosophers and scientists around the world to help solve some great problems in philosophy, in physics, in biology, and in psychology. I also hope to reach any of you who are wondering about the deepest nature of reality and our place in the universe. We live in the information age, but I find that few philosophers or scientists understand the nature of information. Information is neither matter nor energy. Information needs matter to be embodied, in our brains, for example. And it needs energy to be communicated, like this lecture coming to you over the internet. But matter and energy are conserved quantities. It may be hard to believe, but the total amount of matter and energy today is the same as there was at the beginning of the universe. And if the stuff of the material world is just a fixed total amount, what can possibly explain all the evolutionary change that we see? These changes are the information and order in the universe, which have been increasing since the beginning of time. Despite the second law of thermodynamics, which destroys order, change is simply the arrangement of the atoms and molecules into what I call information structures, including the galaxies, the stars, and the planets. But stars are passive objects under the complete control of physical forces like gravity. But living things, you and I, are dynamic and growing information structures under our own control. I'll show you that we are forms through which matter and energy continuously flow. And I'll show its information processing from the DNA in our cells to the thinking in our minds that controls those flows of matter and energy. Information is the modern spirit, the ghost in the machine, the mind in the body. It's our soul. And when we die, it's the information that perishes. Only our matter remains. Information philosophy, I'll show, can also explain some mysterious aspects of quantum physics, like the two-slit experiment, the collapse of the wave function, and entanglement, which claims a cat can be simultaneously dead and alive. I hope to show with the work of Albert Einstein that such spooky actions at a distance is simply impossible. Okay, so today I'm hoping to talk to you about the model for free will that I have been explaining on my website, theinformationphilosopher.com, for some years. And it turns out the idea of a free will model has been discussed by or thought about by many other thinkers. And in the years I've been studying the idea of a two-stage model for free will, I've found another dozen or so thinkers who have had something very similar to what it is that I am proposing. I've listed them on my page, and I perhaps should show you a little bit about how the page works by going to, just for a moment, let me show you that on my blog, which is located at i-phi.org, today's lecture is going to be, I'm calling it Why We Are Free, the two-stage model of free will. This model of human freedom involves two stages, one in which we have randomness and another in which we have a kind of determination, but not a predetermination from the earliest moments in the universe, which is the claim for some extreme thinkers on the problem of free will. You may recall that last time we talked about the standard argument against free will, And I think I have that here somewhere. Let me just bring that up for a moment to remind you of what we were doing. The standard argument against free will is to say that it's a very logical argument. It starts with the idea that if determinism is the case in the world, if everything that happens is happening according to physical laws, biological laws, laws of nature, then if determinism is true, the will cannot be free, because our will be determined by those laws or by an overall idea some have that perhaps an omniscient God knows everything that's going to happen in the future, and therefore what you do has already been established by the will of God. On the other hand, logically, determinism may not be true. And if that's the case, one says there's indeterminism, which is to say real chance exists in the universe. And if there are chance, random events happening, and today quantum physics, as I'll show, has told us that at the quantum level, at the microscopic level, there is in fact real chance. There is indeterminism there. Well, says this standard argument against free will, if there is randomness truly in the world, then some of our actions may be random. And that certainly wouldn't be the kind of influence we would expect to allow us to be responsible for our actions. So once again, if the world is determined and we are determined by natural laws, then we're not free. Our will is not free. And if there are random actions and they somehow contribute to our actions, then those actions were random. We can hardly take responsibility for those actions of ours, because it appears they happened at random and we weren't involved in what happened. That's the standard argument against free will. So let's come back to our two-stage model. The two-stage model is going to try to take those two arguments, if determined not free, if random not responsible, and have a suggestion or an explanation to deal with each of them, and in a temporal order, so that there's a first stage and a second stage. And I should go to my my page. Let's navigate by going to Information Philosopher. Say, here we are. Let's just go to this screen. And our argument is to look at this decision as a moment in time between the past and the future. Now, the early thinkers who argued about this said, clearly there is a past where everything is now fixed because we cannot change the past. And right up at the moment of decision, there is a given past. All of the molecules in our cells, in our brain, our neurons, are all in a certain state. When we make the decision, they thought, they imagine the decision process takes place in a single moment. And the moment after the decision must be completely causally determined by the conditions of our brains, our minds, immediately before the decision. And this is the argument I would like to use to say this is not reasonable. I say collapsing the decision to a single moment between this closed fixed past and the open and ambiguous future makes it difficult to see the role of our thoughts in the mind, followed by a willed and adequately determined action of the body. And to understand this, I propose that we take that simple idea that there's just one moment for the decision and break it up into a temporal sequence. And in the first moment of thinking about some event, we have put the past behind us, or the past is falling away behind us. And in the first stage of my two-stage model, the mind thinks about alternative possibilities that we can act on. And that assumes that some of those possibilities are randomly appearing in our mind. And that randomness, if it is genuine randomness, if it is randomness at the microscopic level, at the basic level of quantum phenomena, then it breaks the chain of determinism and a causal chain into the past. And that's, of course, what we're trying to do. Then, given those possibilities, let's assume there's a second stage in which the possibilities are evaluated, the alternatives are evaluated. Now, in this stage, it would be best if there is no randomness. And that means in the second stage, we need to think that what our brain is doing or what our mind is doing is not leaving itself open to quantum randomness, possibly because the evaluation process occurs at a very high level. Just think that what goes on when we think about possibilities is we retrieve information from past experiences, past situations that we've been in, and those all come rushing back to us to try to offer us up alternative things to do next or to say next. And some of those may contain an element of randomness. But once we have in mind the 2 or 3 or more possibilities for the thing to do next, now the part of our brain that is large enough not to be susceptible to random noise evaluates the different options quickly, but and sometimes we spend a lot of time deliberating over the things we might do. And it's very clear if we have a lot of time and we give a lot of care to the evaluation, examining each alternative, how does it stack up against our reasons for doing things, our motives, our feelings, and other things that are rather larger and important in our brain, that process can be said to be determined, but not predetermined, okay? The predetermination argument is that everything depends on the past, but having brought up new possibilities for action and considered them in our brain or mind, we can now say, the evaluation process is adequately determined, is a term I've introduced. That is to say, there's some statistical randomness possible still here, but it's more or less negligible. And we go on thinking about the possibilities and then pick one of them, and it's what I call adequately determined. So what we've done in our 2-stage model is to have some randomness in the first stage, and then some determinism, or determination is a better term, some careful choice between the alternatives, and that combination of some randomness in generating possibilities and some adequate determinism in deciding what to do, and having our body, which is a very large object compared to quantum level noise, executing our actions, mean that our actions are caused by us as an agent, because in our minds we have come up with those possibilities and acted on one of them. So let's look again at our list of people who have considered 2-stage models. My own work, I should say, was done in the 1970s, and I initially didn't know that anyone else had a model anything like mine, but studying the literature, I found that I have here on my list about a dozen people who have said something more or less like my thinking, and I've used their words in one very important case, namely the work of William James. William James was as far as I can tell, the first person to use the terminology and accept the idea that there is indeterminism in the world. That is to say, the world is not completely deterministic, and it is therefore possible for what he called chance to be playing a role. And I'm just going to go. The Jamesian picture of free will, which was first written up in a lecture that James gave to the Harvard Divinity School graduating class in 1884, and what he basically described is that indeterminism would be the source for what he called, and I call, alternative possibilities. And he also introduced the notion of ambiguous futures. If we look back at our two-stage model, we see we're talking about fixed past and a future which is not fixed. It's not yet determined. And I'm going to try to show that the determination of the future depends on what we do when we evaluate our alternatives. Now, coming back to the large number of people who've thought about this, following James, I found the great mathematician and physicist Henri Poincaré. I found a physicist, Arthur Holly Compton, who was the first one to see that quantum randomness, basically what's called uncertainty by the founders of quantum mechanics, could play a role. Unfortunately, they described the randomness from quantum mechanics coming up and making us act, and that would be a mistake because that would make the randomness the cause of our actions. And it was never a really good idea to think that the randomness led directly to actions. Clearly, that would have been objected to by those who argued against any role for randomness in freedom of the will. But then, after Popper, the next person I found talking about a two-stage model was Daniel Dennett of Tufts University here. And Dan and I have been back and forth over what it is he proposed. And I'll spend a lot of time, I'm choosing Dan for our philosopher for our Wednesday lecture this week, and we'll go much more deeply into his model. But let me just say, he clearly accepted the separation of the creation of possibilities from the choice in the second stage. But Dan believed that the mind is a computer. It's so-called computational model of mind. Many philosophers of mind today have this strong interest in computers, which Dan had going back for many, many years. And he does not believe that quantum indeterminism is essential to the model of the two-stage model of free will that he put forward. And I basically disagree with him on that, and we'll get into more of it later. So coming back to James's two-stage model, let's listen to what he had to say to the graduates of the Divinity School. He said, "What is meant by saying that my choice of which way to walk home after the lecture is ambiguous and a matter of chance? It means that both Divinity Avenue and Oxford Street are called, but only one, and that one, either one, shall be chosen." Now, I think this must have been a strong and somewhat difficult lesson for divinity school students to hear, because the norm for those who are deep into their religion is the idea that God basically knows what's going to happen. And it was argued for centuries that chance, that is to say, objective, what's called ontological chance, real chance, as opposed to epistemological chance, in the sense that things are not, we do not know what's going on, and we think they're random because we do not know enough about what's going on. That's a favorite of philosophers who argue that it's the limitation on human reason that gives us the feeling that some things happen by chance. And surely the argument went for centuries, real chance would be atheistical thinking that would suggest that God's omniscience didn't extend to knowing everything, following laws, divine laws or natural laws of nature, since in recent centuries where physics seems to be the basic explanation for everything deep that's going on. So here in this one lecture, he basically says there are alternatives, the future is ambiguous, it's up to me whether I walk home by Divinity Avenue or down Oxford Street. And he told them to think about it in this way. He said, going down to the next second paragraph here, James asked the students to consider, to imagine his actions repeated in exactly the same circumstances, which is a modern interesting question, whether we could do otherwise in exactly the same circumstances. And he anticipates much of modern modal reasoning in this little talk. He says, quote, "Imagine that I first walk through Divinity Avenue, and then imagine that the powers governing the universe annihilate 10 minutes of time with all that it contained, and set me back at the door of this hall just as I was before the choice was made. Imagine then that, everything else being the same, I now make a different choice and traverse Oxford Street. You, as passive spectators, look on and see these two alternative universes." And there's a striking image, right? With today's notion of parallel universes, multiple worlds, many worlds, all simultaneously existing. And here's James, 130 years ago, talking about another possible universe. Now, one of these universes with me walking through Divinity Avenue in it, and the other with the same me walking through Oxford Street. Now, if you are determinists, you believe one of these universes to have been from eternity impossible. You believe it to have been impossible because of the intrinsic irrationality or accidentality somewhere involved in it. But looking outward at these two universes, can you say which is the impossible one and which the accidental one, and which the rational and necessary one? I doubt if the most ironclad determinist among you could have the slightest glimmer of light on this point. So James is certainly challenging these young people to say, surely if you see me walking down Oxford Street, it looks to you as if you're doing whatever was in the future for the universe. But if you see me walking down Divinity Avenue, you probably would think the same thing. A determinist picture just says what you're doing now has been determined by the past, but you really can't prove that there wasn't another future. Now, just coming back to Dan Dennett, whom we will talk about tomorrow, Dan doesn't believe in these alternative futures because he's what's called a compatibilist, who believes that free will is compatible with physical determinism. And as a result, he gives these marvelous lectures. Maybe I'll get a quote out of one of his YouTube presentations, in which he says that libertarians believe they can change the future. And he says, change the future from what to what? And he gets a really big laugh out of large audiences, Cambridge University a couple of years ago, because Dan Dennett is what's called an actualist. An actualist who is someone who believes that whatever becomes actual was the only thing that could have become actual. That is to say, the future is already out there. Everything that's going to become actual may appear now to be one of many things that are possible, but an actualist thinks that no, only the one that becomes actual is possible to become actual. Of all the possibilities, the one that will become actual is the only one that can become actual. It's a very ancient idea, goes back to before Aristotle, and we can talk about that at some time. But coming back to James, I think we basically covered his ideas. So I would like to now bring you forward to my work on free will. And I have here my desktop, where I have my screens, which I've shown in some of my talk. Here we have the screen with the two-stage model of a fixed past, and then events that we are first generating possibilities, then evaluating those possibilities, and then going into the ambiguous future. Here's my James quotations. And here in the middle is my book on free will. And you'll see that I've subtitled this book, The Scandal in Philosophy. And the reason I've chosen such an extreme subtitle, which hasn't won me many friends in the philosophical community for understandable reasons, it's that teaching that we are determined, teaching that everything we do is compatible with the world being determined, and we're just part of the physical world, we're just another material object following the laws of matter. That to me is a mistake. It's a real problem to teach students that they are in effect a sort of robot, they are subject to the laws of the universe and can't do anything as a result that's original, that the universe didn't already include. I basically, let's see if I can zoom in a little more closely here. Well, there's someone else who thinks there's a scandal involved in free will, and that's John Searle, who basically says it's a scandal that after all the centuries of writing about free will, we haven't made very much progress. And what I'm trying to say, though, is that looking over all of the different forms of determinism that have been used to deny human freedom and responsibility, and by the way, I've identified at least a dozen different kinds of determinism, not just physical determinism, but others like biological and psychological and, of course, religious ideas, and later in lectures we'll go over many of them to try to look at them individually. Even many people who claim to be libertarian free willerists or whatever, they think that it's a metaphysical mystery. Often they're religious themselves and think that God has given human beings a capability for freedom, even though that seems to conflict with God's omniscience. But one that cannot be simply explained by having it depend on other intelligible mysteries such as quantum mechanics or a mysterious gift of God. So what I've done is basically written up the two-stage model of free will, which we've discussed a little bit, and that's a key necessity for us to be creative and bring new information in the universe, as we'll see. But why is it a scandal? I'd like to try to defend my claim that it's a scandal. And to do that, what I'd like to do is look at a number of other books on the subject, especially those that have appeared in the last decade or so. I have a more or less random selection. I've been buying books on free will for more than a couple decades, and going backwards, I now have about 300 books on free will from the very earliest times to the present time. And this is a reasonably typical one. You'll see in the bottom here, this author claims that how we settled for the illusion of morality. Notice it's a free will delusion, and there always has been a connection between the idea of freedom, human freedom, or free will, and whether or not we can be responsible. The problem of responsibility, to me, is a problem for the culture, for the sources of our notion of what is good and what is bad. And the notion of free will really is more of a scientific question of whether or not the laws of nature are, in fact, determined down to the smallest details. Here's another book, Breaking the Free Will Illusion. Okay, and this too connects to this idea of illusion. There's an illusionism, and that much of what we think we know is just an illusion. To me, I think that's a mistake to be telling young people that they are living an illusion. Now here's a book by a very prominent determinist, a hard determinist, believes that there's absolutely no free will, and therefore there's no moral responsibility. Greg Caruso, I'm thinking of reaching out to him and maybe getting him to come on our program someday. Here's a book that says neurobiology is about to find out that our neurons are really in charge of what we're doing. And that's odd, because I say, wait a minute, those are our neurons. If our neurons are doing things that help us make decisions, why couldn't they be free decisions? Just because these scientists think they can reduce us to our brain, and we are nothing but a brain which is material. And those who think there's some freedom involved often want to say, well, there's an immaterial mind, like René Descartes' notion of a mind that is in another realm, above and beyond the material realm. Here's one called My Brain Made Me Do It, and at least this thinker, when you read him carefully, he says, but maybe we are our brains. And so he's skeptical about others like the neurobiologists who argued that our neurons make us do it. Now this is a late Dan Wegner, late professor at Harvard and co-author of a wonderful text on psychology, one of the 4 leading texts on psychology, all of which I bought and have been reading in order to see what they say about the mind as opposed to the brain. You saw the people here saying the brain is in charge, and they doubt whether we have a mind. And when I looked in these 4 books on psychology, which we'll visit again, I hope, in the future, I looked in their indexes, and I found in the index that one of the 4 books, when you look up mind, it has no entry for mind. It seems almost unbelievable. Another book I looked in, the index entry for mind says, comma, see brain, which is clearly the kind of thinking that goes on today in psychology. But the nicest one of these books, and I think this one, author, Dan Wegner and 2 other Dans at Harvard, their book at least said mind, and explained that it was the idea of a psyche, and they argued that psychology was the science, the study of the mind. And at least they had an open mind, that there might be something to be said about the mind in a book on psychology. But once again, here his metaphor is, it's just our will, what he calls our conscious will, is an illusion. Here's a book by a fellow whose father was a prominent Calvinist determinist, and he, I think, shares a basis in the notion that we don't have any freedom because we're acting without the kind of freedom that others imagine we have. He calls this living without free will, guidance on how to get by in the world when you really aren't free to do anything. Another book who basically argues that it's an illusion we're dealing with here. This is a prominent determinist from Israel who says, if it's an illusion, then it's untrue that we are responsible for our actions. But he gets upset at what that might mean to people if we told more and more people that they are just not free at all and they're basically robots. He thinks that would do more harm to society than to just go along and keep letting them believe they have freedom, because it leads to reasonable behaviors. It's a kind of an interesting thing for him to both deny it and then say, don't tell everybody, because it would make things worse for us. Now, I've got 3 more books for you, and all of them have a kind of metaphor implicit in their graphics. This is Sam Harris, who is a very well-known writer on issues of freedom, and a very prominent atheist. He belongs to the 4 leading thinkers, including Dan Dennett, who call themselves Brights, and they are said to argue that everything is completely determined. But when I talk about the metaphor on this cover, where normally determinists just assume that we're being determined because of the laws of sciences, this seems to suggest that the control of our freedom is coming down from above, with these little cross sticks for the puppeteer to hold on to. I don't have a puppeteer, but it does seem to me that an unacceptable notion, because it communicates the idea that there's someone or something else controlling what we do. I've tried to reach Sam Harris, but he's too popular and doesn't answer emails. And at the moment, I'm still working on it. Here's another book which has a variation on this notion that we don't have much choice. The choice is limited. This poor little fish in the fishbowl has a bunch of hooks to choose from, but it's not a very positive notion of choice that's being portrayed here. And finally, and this is a very important book because of the author, Michael Gazzaniga is in many ways the world's leading neuroscientist. He was in on the days when people with epileptic seizures and other difficulties in the brain were operated on, not with the lobotomies where they took out the frontal lobe, but in the lab, Roger Sperry's lab in California, they divided the two hemispheres of the brain. And when they do that, some very strange things happen. We learned that one hemisphere is usually in charge of certain things like language. And when you separate the two hemispheres, they both can still see, because one hemisphere is looking with one eye. Surprisingly, the right hemisphere is looking through the left eye, and vice versa, because the neurons that connect the eye, the retina, back into the brain and the visual cortex on the back side of the brain cross over in the middle. But that's just a detail. The problem was that that part of the brain who was able to speak could only see through one eye. And the other part of the brain couldn't see anything. And the connecting tissue, the neurons, which connected across what's called the corpus callosum, were apparently telling the language, the side that doesn't have language, they were giving it enough information from the side that does have language to coordinate all of the thinking that was going on in the brain. And once it had been cut down the middle, we had a brain that really didn't know what was going on. And Gazzaniga very cleverly built little partitions, a wall between the two eyes, so that he could present certain things on one side and then ask the other brain what was going on. Very clever work. And he came up with the idea that many times the brain does what's a kind of confabulation. It makes up stories to explain, to interpret what's going on out there. And he came to a very deep conclusion that it's all going on and we are not in charge. That's the point of the Who's in Charge title. And once again, there you see the puppeteer's sticks up there, as if there is some other agency, which I do not think that Michael Gazzaniga thinks there's another agency. It's just unfortunate that this is the kind of imagery which communicates to, again, young people. I don't want them thinking that someone else is in charge, as much as Michael Gazzaniga's work is extraordinarily good science. Gazzaniga runs a large foundation funded by former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and he's a major source of funding for research into the brain and into the problem of free will and responsibility, because Sandra O'Connor's interest is in how much the law should take into account the fact that neuroscientists like Gazzaniga think that without free will we're not responsible. And you know the old argument that we mitigate the responsibility and limit the punishment and other things for persons that we judge to be somehow unable to act freely. Maybe they're mentally deficient in some way, maybe they're addicted to something. These are kind of ways to put constraints on their actions, not the same as the constraint if you're in jail or in chains, but if it limits you and you can't act in a way that society thinks is a free and responsible way, you get punished. But there's a large number of people who want to declare that we're none of us responsible for anything we do and we should eliminate punishment entirely, which is a bit strange. Okay, so I am now basically justifying the idea that free will is a scandal if it's taught as such, that we have no free will whatsoever. Now, I just want to point out that my book is available in a print form in Harvard Bookstore and on Amazon and so forth. But I've taken the pages of this book, which I've laid out myself using a desktop publishing program. I actually wrote the first desktop publishing program for the Apple Macintosh back in 1984 in the hopes that I would produce these books. Then I procrastinated for 30 years or more, and I'm finally around to writing my books. And when I've created the pages, they're all actually PDFs which go to a print-on-demand service. And I've taken those PDFs and I've put them all up on my website. Let's see if I can bring up my website for you. It's informationphilosopher.com, and that's my email. And on informationphilosopher.com, we have, let me turn this one off and go to this one and just come up here and type in, let's see, this looks like a reasonable one to do it on. I've got various screens. This is our screen on the two-stage model, but let me quickly go to books.com, and I guess I didn't type it correctly, one letter wrong. Bear with me. This is, oh, I don't want .com. Apologies. Try this one. There we go. Here you'll find, there's my free will book. It's the one at the top. And if you click on the free will book, here you'll find, when you go down a bit, every single chapter in the book is available to you by just clicking on, say we wanted the introduction. Here comes a PDF, and here's the introduction. Behind it is my taxonomy of the different classifications I've made of determinism, and so forth. So I just want you to know those are available. So let's see, let's come back here and think where we are. I want you to take into consideration this notion that our freedom comes from a random event or events, not all the time. Many times when we do things, we just do them because of habit. We've done them before, we do them the same way again. But when there really are choices between different ones, then you might be able to randomly choose between them, and or we would imagine that you might think about something that you've never thought of before, and you've randomly generated a new idea. Now, let's come back to William James. I think I have something in here. No, not really. I need to go to the William James page, because James had an idea. I'm going to just switch to this page. James had an idea that what people were saying, he called determinism, but he called it hard determinism and soft determinism, because he was distinguishing between the notion that the laws had completely determined everything and the idea of people who wanted to say that there was a freedom that was compatible today. We call it compatibilism. He called it soft determinism, and he called it a wretched subterfuge. He says, old-fashioned determinism was what we may call hard determinism. It did not shrink from such words as fatality, bondage of the will, necessitation, and the like. Nowadays, we have a soft determinism which abhors these harsh words, and repudiating fatality, necessity, and even predetermination, says that its real name is freedom. For freedom is only necessity understood, and bondage to the highest is identical with true freedom. And there's a strong thread of this in many modern religions, that you are free when you're following the laws of God. Famous Hegel notion was that a freely falling stone was correctly perceived to be free because it's following the laws of gravity. And it seems totally backwards to me, but many people feel that when they're doing what has to be done, then somehow they are free. And if they were to do something otherwise, it might be a crime in the eyes of God, or it would be a miracle, according to those who think that the laws don't allow freedom. laws do not allow such things, and if there were such things, they would be miracles, and modern science just says there are no miracles. But given this two-stage notion of alternative possibilities, William James went on to connect the idea of Darwinian evolution. And I see if I have found that here on his page somewhere. Here we are. What James noticed was a strong similarity between genetic evolution and the evolution of ideas. And this, of course, is very interesting to me. He says, a remarkable parallel, which I think has never been noticed, obtains between the facts of social evolution on the one hand and of zoological evolution as expounded by Mr. Darwin on the other. Darwin's achievement was to define the true problem with which we have to deal when we study the effects of the environment on the animal. The problem is simply this: is the environment more likely to preserve or destroy him on account of this or that peculiarity? So what James seems to be saying is that the accidental variations in species having mutations and so forth might be very similar to his thinking on the human mind. Because think of it for a moment. Suppose a generation or an individual in the next generation of some species has an accidental variation. We call them mutations, something wrong with their genetic code, their DNA. Normally, that change is not a helpful one. And normally, when there are mutations, they are not successful at reproducing and they just disappear. But these differences that occur now offer a truly different possibility for that species, and we may in fact bring into existence another species. Now, if the first few members who are mutated away from their ancestors are not successful, we don't get a new result. But where in the mind model, in the two-stage model of our thinking, we apply our reasons and our motives and our feelings and make sure that our choice is consistent with our character. And here you can argue that this comparison that James saw between his thinking and Darwin's thinking, that ideas are generated also by accident, just like biological species. It's a little weak, but I encourage you to kind of stay with it for a moment. And now, when the new mutated species develops, it goes out into the world, it may be in a world or a niche in the world that is somehow more favorable to this new, potentially new species. And if so, what we have is a randomness which we now know that much of the damage that causes genetic mutations, some of it is purely physical and breaking of a easily understood part, but some of it is being broken by cosmic rays and other radiation effects, which are definitely quantum mechanical effects. And so we have, like my model, my two-stage model of free will, we have a random event leading to something new. It's a kind of creation of something new. And it then either succeeds or it doesn't, because in the second stage of the model, it's, in our case, evaluated mentally by us. In the biology parallel, according to James, the environment then works on the variation and either gives it a better chance or a much worse chance for surviving, which is the normal one. But that's a very important underpinning for the two-stage model of free will. Now, whether or not there is a mind which is different from our brain is a question that I believe can be answered by thinking about our mind as information and not matter and energy. As I opened the lecture today, matter and energy are conserved quantities. We always have the same amount at all times. There's matter can be converted into energy because of Einstein's famous insight that E equals mc squared, meaning that if you take a mass m and demolish it and turn it into energy, it produces an amount which is the square of the speed of light times the matter, say 1 gram, turns into an enormous amount of energy. In that work, Einstein had seen what would become nuclear energy. Unfortunately, bombs, but also nuclear reactors that generate electricity and so forth for us. But this connection is that if you destroy some matter, it becomes energy, and it's possible for energy to turn into matter. So the very earliest universe, we have a picture in which the temperatures are so high that there's just sort of light in all directions, photons, a great deal of energy. And at some point, that turns into the fundamental elementary particles like quarks. The electrons are probably around already. There's a lot of work going on to try to understand how the universe all came about, but the picture is that when quarks arrange themselves into neutrons and protons and electrons get together with neutrons perhaps to make atoms, and atoms eventually form molecules, what we're seeing here is the emergence, and emergence is a very important word in philosophy today, because there are many who think that nothing ever emerges. Those who think that the universe was known already in some sense and that everything happening today was implicit in the information at the beginning of the universe, they're all mistaken, I'm fairly convinced, because we can say that we see new information structures, the atoms themselves, then the molecules, and things cool down, and the energy is reduced, and we have a lot of matter, and those two add up to be the same thing. The world, the universe becomes cooler and cooler and cooler until it gets down to a few thousand degrees, 5,000 degrees, absolute, Kelvin, at which time is when the time when protons combine with electrons to make atoms. And at that time, the universe suddenly becomes transparent. We'll work on this a lot when we come around to our cosmology lectures. At that time, we can now see to long distances. Indeed, today, the universe is transparent enough for us to look back all the way to what's called the surface of the original fireball, the cosmic microwave background it's called, because that 5,000 degrees temperature has cooled down to under 3 degrees, and we see this as microwave radiation in all directions around us, totally symmetric and even, because we're looking at the surface of the universe at a time when it was even in all directions except for very slight variations. And then the universe cooled more and more and more. It cooled down into below the temperature we are at on the Earth, and it was quite dark. But then gravity went to work on the matter distribution, which was more or less random, and formed collapsed objects into the stars, the galaxies, and cold objects like the planets, at which time the stars formed as sort of in a very dark background, suddenly bright spots of light all around, some of them enormously energetic like supernovae, but just bright dots of light. If you were there at that time, of course there was nothing human, nothing living, you would have seen just star-like things appearing in the dark sky. And then that was maybe 400 million years after the beginning. We have to wait another 8 or 9 billion years before the Earth, as a planet around the sun, comes in a situation where the light and heat from the sun provides a nice possibility of taking in that warmth and using the energy from it, and then dissipating by radiating away excess heat on the dark side of the planet as we are on the night side. And this gives us a possibility of information structures on the surface of the planet duplicating themselves, and that's the first appearance of proto-life. Maybe 3.5 billion years ago, some molecules began duplicating themselves and I do a lot of it perhaps, but then one makes a mistake and does it differently. And if the difference is better than the original, that replication takes over more and more. Eventually we get more and more complicated things like cells, and those cells have a sort of purpose in life to duplicate themselves. Bacteria just go on merrily making more of themselves at all times as long as there's energy coming in from the sun, and they use that energy to reorganize themselves. I describe it as information that's been encoded in the DNA and in the biological processes, which is in charge of using that energy flow that comes in from the sun. And even bacteria have a matter flow because elements inside the cells break down and they get replaced. And in order to do that, there has to be a supply of food that comes in and an elimination of the dead parts of it. So we have a strong, long picture of how the universe came about, and it seems it involves a certain amount of randomness, and then a certain amount of controls. In this case, I'm trying to say that the controlling entity in a living thing is quite different from passive things. The stars, the planet itself, starts to have certain interesting differentiation things that geologists can see things going on, and they can talk about laws of how it happens. But for the most part, the matter in the planet or in a sun, a star, or the galaxies are all behaving passively under the forces, like physical forces, gravity first and foremost, but at their individual objects forming, like molecules, there are laws here, which are nuclear force laws for the nuclei, and chemical forces, different kinds. And it isn't anything like ideas being in charge. But there comes a time, and that's the time we see it in all cells, that the flow of matter and energy is under the control of what we can think of as programs. We can think of as software in the living hardware. And the software is pure information, which is why I think of myself as an information philosopher. So we are probably going to go back tomorrow to some thoughts about free will and its two-stage model. And I will particularly want to look at the work of Dan Dennett, because his model, as I will show, was the best thought out model, involving a little bit of indeterminism. But as Dan says, he put that indeterminism in the first step because he thought it was the right place for indeterminism. And then he said, if indeterminism plays any role at all. There was his skepticism and his notion that he's more comfortable with a kind of computational model, as if the brain is a computer and our man is a machine and so forth. So Dan will, to this day, debate whether or not our freedom consists of, or depends in any way, on the randomness, the uncertainty, the indeterminacy of quantum physics. But that's something I will argue for going forward. Now, looking over at my monitor for CCTV, I see we've going off topic. I need to be learning how much my programming goes out to YouTube, which I think is still working for us, and Facebook. I hope you'll be able to join me and find me on informationphilosopher.com. Once again, here is my address, email, and my website. I look forward to hearing you again tomorrow, being with you again tomorrow, while we look into the career of Dan Dennett on our talks about philosophers and scientists. Thank you very much.